In January 2023, federal agents raided a modest brick home in Tucson, Arizona. They expected to find a fentanyl laboratory hidden inside. What they discovered instead would expose one of the most devastating blind spots in American border security. Inside that house, they found roughly 40 kilograms of powdered chemicals, neatly packaged and waiting to be transported across the border into Mexico. The chemicals had arrived at this address not through secret tunnels or armed convoys, but through the same delivery system that brings millions of Americans their everyday purchases: regular packages, standard tracking numbers, routine deliveries. The homeowner, a 63-year-old maintenance worker named Wadi Dahir, had no idea what he was actually transporting. He thought he was delivering agricultural chemicals for a client he knew only as Engineer Jonathan. Federal investigators later estimated that over roughly 2 years, Dahir had unknowingly ferried approximately 7,000 kilograms of fentanyl precursors to operatives linked to the Sinaloa cartel. That quantity of chemicals, according to independent chemists, could produce approximately 5.3 billion fentanyl pills, enough to kill every person in the United States several times over. And the most disturbing part of this discovery was not what the chemicals could produce. It was how easily they had entered the country in the first place. Those deadly ingredients had flown across the Pacific Ocean from China, cleared customs at Los Angeles International Airport, and traveled to Arizona through America's standard shipping infrastructure without triggering a single alarm. The gateway that made this possible was not a failure of border security. It was a feature of American trade policy. A few paragraphs buried in a 2016 law that most Americans have never heard of, a provision designed to help small businesses and online shoppers that has quietly become the most efficient drug corridor in the Western Hemisphere. To understand how this happened, you need to understand a term that sounds almost insignificant: de minimis. The phrase comes from Latin and translates roughly to too small to bother about. In the context of American trade law, it refers to packages valued below a certain threshold that are allowed to enter the country with minimal paperwork, no duties, and virtually no inspection. For decades, that threshold was low: $5 in the 1970s, $200 in 1994. Then, in 2016, everything changed. Major delivery companies like FedEx, UPS, and DHL had been lobbying for years to raise the limit. They argued that collecting duties on small packages cost more than the revenue generated. E-commerce platforms like eBay joined the effort, positioning small American sellers as the face of the campaign. The argument was persuasive. Why burden customs officers with inspecting boxes of T-shirts and phone cases when they could focus on more important shipments? Congress agreed. In February 2016, the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act was signed into law. Buried inside was a short provision that quadrupled the de minimis threshold from $200 to $800, one of the highest limits in the world. The impact was immediate. In fiscal year 2015, before the change, roughly 134 million de minimis packages entered the United States. By 2023, that number had exploded to over 1 billion packages. By 2024, it reached nearly 1.4 billion. The vast majority of these shipments came from China, many carrying merchandise worth far less than the $800 limit. The average declared value of a de minimis package in fiscal 2023 was just $54. For legitimate commerce, this was a revolution. Consumers gained access to cheaper goods from around the world. Small businesses could source products directly from overseas manufacturers. The era of fast, affordable e-commerce had arrived. But criminal organizations were watching too. And they saw something different. They saw a highway with no checkpoints. The mechanics of how this system was exploited are both simple and terrifying. Chinese chemical traders, many operating small companies or even family-run operations, began selling fentanyl precursors online. These are the raw ingredients needed to manufacture fentanyl, chemicals with names like 4-AP that have legitimate industrial uses but can also be synthesized into one of the deadliest drugs ever created. When Mexican cartels wanted to produce fentanyl, they needed these chemicals. And China, the world's largest chemical producer, had plenty of suppliers willing to sell. The challenge was getting the chemicals into North America without detection. Traditional smuggling routes were risky. Bulk shipments by sea could be intercepted. Large packages raised suspicions, but small boxes flying into American airports alongside millions of other e-commerce parcels, those disappeared into the flood. According to a Reuters investigation, Chinese sellers became so confident their shipments would evade detection that some offered a guarantee. If customs intercepted a package, they would send a free replacement. The system worked like this. A cartel operative in Mexico would place an order with a Chinese precursor supplier. The supplier would package the chemicals, often mislabeling them as something mundane like pigment ink or industrial solvent. The package would be handed off to a major delivery company, bundled into a master carton alongside thousands of legitimate shipments, and flown to the United States. At customs, the sheer volume of packages made comprehensive inspection impossible. Officials estimate that less than 2 to 3% of incoming shipments can be physically examined without grinding global commerce to a halt. The de minimis packages, already exempt from detailed paperwork, moved through even faster. Once inside the country, the precursors were shipped to addresses like Wadi Dahir's home in Tucson. From there, informal couriers transported them across the border into Mexico. In cartel-controlled laboratories, chemists transformed the raw chemicals into fentanyl. The finished product was then smuggled back into the United States, hidden in vehicles, carried by individuals crossing at legal ports of entry, or tunneled through underground passages. The supply chain formed a complete circle. Chinese chemicals entered America duty-free through a loophole designed for t-shirts and electronics. They traveled south to become poison. Then they returned north to kill. The human cost of this system is measured in bodies. Fentanyl is not like other drugs. It is approximately 50 times more potent than heroin and 100 times more potent than morphine. A dose of just 2 milligrams, roughly the weight of a few grains of salt, can be lethal. Because fentanyl is so cheap to produce, cartels have begun mixing it into virtually everything. Users buying what they believe is cocaine, methamphetamine, or prescription painkillers often have no idea fentanyl is present until it is too late. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, synthetic opioids, primarily fentanyl, have become the leading cause of overdose deaths in the United States. In 2023, more than 72,000 Americans died from fentanyl overdoses alone. Over 250,000 have died since 2021. The death toll from fentanyl has now exceeded the number of American soldiers killed in World War II, and behind every statistic is a story. A college student who took what he thought was a Ritalin pill. A construction worker who bought a counterfeit Percocet. A teenager who experimented once and never woke up. The Drug Enforcement Administration has been blunt in its messaging. One pill can kill. The agency's own seizure data tells the story of a crisis accelerating beyond control. In 2025, the DEA seized more than 47 million fentanyl-laced counterfeit pills and nearly 10,000 pounds of fentanyl powder. Each pound of fentanyl powder contains enough doses to kill hundreds of thousands of people. And despite these seizures, the supply keeps flowing because the pipeline feeding it has been operating largely unchecked for years. The criminal organizations behind this trade are not small-time dealers. They are multinational enterprises with revenues rivaling Fortune 500 companies. The Sinaloa Cartel, one of the two dominant players in the fentanyl trade, has been described by former White House officials as a massive global enterprise bigger than a Fortune 50 company that can outfight the government of Mexico in certain places. The cartel's leadership has evolved over decades, adapting to shifts in drug demand and law enforcement pressure. When prescription opioid restrictions tightened in the United States, creating millions of addicted users suddenly cut off from their supply, the Sinaloa Cartel pivoted to meet that demand, first with heroin, then with fentanyl. The other major player, Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, has similarly expanded its fentanyl operations, competing for dominance in a market worth tens of billions of dollars annually. Both organizations source their precursor chemicals primarily from Chinese suppliers. They manufacture fentanyl in Mexican laboratories using recipes often provided by those same suppliers, and they distribute the finished product throughout the United States using networks of transporters, distributors, and street-level dealers. The relationship between Chinese chemical networks and Mexican cartels has become so intertwined that payments sometimes bypass cash entirely. According to investigations into wildlife trafficking, cartels have paid for precursor shipments using valuable marine products like totoaba bladders, which are highly prized in Chinese traditional medicine. The bladders are harvested illegally from Mexican waters and shipped to China as payment, creating a closed loop of criminality that spans 2 continents. More commonly, Chinese money laundering networks have become the preferred financial partners for Mexican cartels. These networks use sophisticated techniques including underground banking systems, trade-based laundering, and cryptocurrency to move cartel profits around the world, while charging fees far lower than traditional money laundering operations. The Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network has issued multiple warnings about the growing threat posed by these Chinese money laundering networks, describing them as global and pervasive. The response to this crisis has unfolded across multiple fronts, though success has been mixed. Diplomatic pressure on China has yielded some results. In 2019, under pressure from the Trump administration, China placed the entire class of fentanyl-type drugs under national control, effectively ending direct exports of finished fentanyl. But that simply shifted the trade to precursor chemicals, which Chinese sellers continued to supply to Mexican cartels. The Biden administration resumed counter-narcotics cooperation with China in late 2023, leading to the scheduling of dozens of precursors and the shutdown of hundreds of websites selling fentanyl ingredients. However, the fundamental loophole remains. Under Chinese law, selling non-scheduled chemicals to criminal organizations is not prosecutable, even when sellers knowingly provide instructions on how to synthesize those chemicals into fentanyl. The Trump administration took more aggressive action targeting the de minimis loophole directly. In April 2025, President Trump signed an executive order eliminating duty-free treatment for low-value imports from China, citing the role of the exemption in facilitating drug trafficking. By August 2025, the de minimis exemption was fully suspended for all commercial shipments from all countries. The change was significant. By December 2025, Customs and Border Protection reported collecting over $1 billion in previously uncollected duties since the loophole began closing. Package volumes from China dropped as the cost advantages of direct-to-consumer shipping disappeared. But critics have noted that closing de minimis alone cannot solve the problem. Traffickers can still hide precursors within large volumes of legitimate cargo. They can ship directly to Mexico, bypassing the United States entirely. And they continue to adapt, finding new chemical formulas that fall outside scheduled controls. In February 2025, the Trump administration also designated 6 Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, a move intended to unlock additional law enforcement tools and asset seizure authorities. The Sinaloa Cartel and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación were among those designated. Whether this designation will meaningfully disrupt cartel operations remains to be seen. Experts have noted that terrorist designations work differently against profit-driven criminal enterprises than against ideologically motivated organizations. The deeper lesson of the de minimis crisis extends beyond any single law or policy. It reveals a fundamental tension at the heart of modern commerce. Systems built for speed and convenience are inherently difficult to secure. The same infrastructure that delivers a textbook to a college student in Ohio can deliver precursor chemicals to a cartel courier in Arizona. The same tracking numbers that reassure consumers their package is on the way can mask shipments of deadly contraband. Trust, when left unprotected, becomes a vulnerability. Millions of Americans never questioned the boxes arriving at their doors because they had no reason to. The labels looked normal. The tracking worked perfectly. The delivery drivers were the same ones who brought their legitimate orders. Yet, behind that ordinary routine, lethal substances were moving at industrial scale. Law enforcement officials have described this as a strategic shift in how organized crime operates. Cartels are no longer simply trying to breach barriers. They are embedding themselves within legitimate systems, using civilian infrastructure as camouflage. The border matters less when the drugs are already inside the country, moving through the same channels as everyday commerce. This realization has profound implications for national security. If one trade loophole can be exploited so effectively for so long, what other vulnerabilities remain undiscovered? E-commerce platforms, logistics networks, payment processors, gig economy services all operate on assumptions of trust and volume that criminal organizations have proven willing and able to exploit. The fight against fentanyl is no longer just about stopping drugs at the border. It is about defending the systems that modern life depends on. It is about recognizing that efficiency and security exist in tension, and that ignoring that tension has consequences measured in human lives. Wadi Dahir, the Tucson maintenance worker who unknowingly transported thousands of kilograms of fentanyl precursors, was never charged. Investigators determined he genuinely did not know what was inside the packages he carried. He died of a heart attack on July 1, 2024, just days after giving his only interview about his inadvertent role in the crisis. Before he died, he expressed remorse for what he had unknowingly helped facilitate. "I see people in the street," he told reporters, drugged up and talking to themselves. "It is really bad." His story captures something essential about how this crisis unfolded. The people caught in the machinery of fentanyl trafficking are not always criminals. Sometimes they are ordinary individuals exploited by systems they do not understand, moving packages they cannot inspect, serving clients they have never met. The chemicals that passed through Dahir's hands traveled from Chinese factories to American airports to Mexican laboratories and back into American communities. Each step in that journey relied on infrastructure designed for legitimate purposes. Each handoff exploited trust that had been built over years of reliable service. The crisis was not caused by a single failure. It emerged from the intersection of global trade, criminal innovation, and policy decisions made with the best of intentions but without anticipating how they could be weaponized. As this chapter of the fentanyl epidemic continues to unfold, the questions it raises have no easy answers. How do you secure a system designed for openness? How do you balance the benefits of free trade against the risks of exploitation? How do you protect citizens from threats that arrive in familiar packaging, labeled and tracked and delivered on schedule? The chemicals have been scheduled. The loophole has been closed. The cartels have been designated. Yet the deaths continue, though recent data suggests they may finally be declining. An estimated 73,000 Americans died from overdoses in the 12 months ending August 2025, down roughly 21% from the previous period. Whether this decline represents a turning point or a temporary fluctuation remains uncertain. What is certain is that the infrastructure of modern commerce will continue to attract criminal interest. The systems we build to make life more convenient will continue to be studied by those seeking to exploit them. And the tension between openness and security will continue to define the boundaries of what is possible. The boxes will keep arriving at doorsteps across America. Most will contain exactly what their labels promise. But the question of what else might be inside and who might be watching for opportunities to exploit that trust will remain long after the current crisis has passed. The packaging may change, the chemicals may evolve, the routes may shift, but the fundamental challenge will endure. In a world built for speed and convenience, protecting what moves through our systems requires vigilance that never ends.